Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
So today, we're actually going to be talking about Kerberoasting. And you might be thinking, Kerberoasting in 2025, what in the world are we doing? Why are we talking about it?
That's what I thought when I saw the notes.
Yeah. So I saw an Ars Technica article, and it was recent, like just a few weeks ago. And I read through it, and I immediately knew that I wanted to talk about it because, it's really rare that Congress gets involved and makes statements about cybersecurity, because most of them are like ancient boomers and they don't really even know how to change the background on their cell phones. But Senator Ron Wyden, who is a Democrat from Oregon, wrote a letter to the FTC chairman, Andrew Ferguson. And he said that his office did an investigation on the 2024 ransomware breach of the healthcare giant Ascension and found that the default support of RC4 encryption cipher was a direct cause, and that the breach led to the theft of millions of medical records from patients. It was like 5.6 million patients. And Adam and I we talked about this breach very briefly in one of our shows last year. The ransomware actually affected up to 140 hospitals in 10 different states, and it took them months to get their electronic healthcare records back up and running. I remember this because my wife is a healthcare provider and she was affected, and she had to go and use paper records for a while and without electronic health records. So it was really interesting at the time. And apparently Senator Wyden's office did an investigation of it. And in the letter he wrote, and I'm going to quote this directly, and then we should probably do our disclaimer, Adam, because we are going to be talking about Microsoft, but I'll read this verbatim from Senator Wyden's letter. He said, because of dangerous software engineering decisions by Microsoft, which the company has largely hidden from its corporate and government customers, a single individual at a hospital or organization clicking on the wrong link can quickly result in an organization-wide ransomware infection. Microsoft has utterly failed to stop or even slow down the scourge of ransomware enabled by its dangerous software. Pretty angry there. Doesn't really hold back, but we'll get into it. But before we do that, we should, do our standard disclaimer, because we are going to be talking about Microsoft, because Senator Wyden obviously is very upset about some of the things that are happening.
Andy and I both work for Microsoft in our field security sales. We do this show outside of work on our own time and self-fund the show. So Microsoft has no direct editorial control or input into the show's content. Of course, we want the show to be factual and fact-based in nature, but we do think our listeners and viewers should understand that when we're talking about Microsoft, we do work about Microsoft. So with this thing we're talking about tonight, Kerberoasting and the RC4 encryption and everything else, we're going to stick to the facts and not try to sprinkle in too many opinions or anything else. But you should be aware that, especially me, as I'm known to do, I may drop a couple opinions from time to time, and you should have that awareness of where we work and who signs our paychecks. So with that said, on with the show.
All right. So let's start with a little bit of the basics. Let's start with RC4 encryption. So what is it and why are we even talking about it in this case? The report from Senator Wyden showed that the default support of RC4 was a direct cause of the ransomware breach, because once they were able to crack the RC4 encryption, they were able to push out some malware, which then resulted in the ransomware, is what their investigation found out. And so RC4 is short for Rivest Cipher 4, which is a nod to a mathematician and cryptographer, Ron Rivest of RCA Security, who developed the Stream cipher in 1987. It was a trade secret, protected proprietary cipher until 1994, when an anonymous party posted a technical description of it to the cypherpunks mail list. I love that. It's kind of cool back in the day. And then within days of that being posted, the algorithm was broken. There are some known susceptibilities to the attacks against RC4. The cipher itself is weak. We won't get into the technical details of why the cipher is weak, but one of the reasons is it's not salted, and there are some pretty glaring holes, like being able to flip bits and being able to, there's like a known stream that like the first couple of bits are also the same. So there's some actual vulnerabilities to the cipher itself. And so even though there are like known vulnerabilities, this cipher has been widely used in encryption protocols, including SSL and TSL, until about a decade ago. Microsoft does continue to support RC4 as a means of securing Active Directory. When Windows clients, if you request an RC4 cipher, they will default to authenticating using that cipher. But for the most part, today in modern encryption, if you have clients like Windows 10 and 11, you'll default to the more secure AES encryption. However, if you allow RC4 to be used, then what happens is an attacker can compromise a device within that organization's network and then use that device to send out an RC4 based authentication request. They receive the response, and then they're able to crack the cryptographic hash that secures that underlying password, which then gives them access to that account and to move laterally. So why are we talking about RC4? Mainly because if you're still using RC4, you're really susceptible to Kerberoasting, which is a known attack since 2014. And this was the attack that was used to escalate and get the credentials, which then sent out the malware and resulted in the ransomware of the healthcare organization, so Ascension. So Kerberoasting, what is it and how can you protect against it? Now, these are, again, pretty well-developed attacks, and we have mitigations against them. We are talking about it because, this letter was just sent out. But Kerberoasting, like I said, has been around since 2014. It's a known attack. Adam and I actually dedicated an entire episode to Kerberoasting back in 2022, episode 106. So like well over 100 episodes ago. But in a nutshell, we're just going to talk about it and then talk about some mitigations, because this is pretty important stuff. Obviously, there's still companies that are susceptible to this. So we're just going to talk about Kerberoasting now, and you should check your environment for it. In a nutshell, in Active Directory, there are some accounts that run services, and they have special tickets called Kerberos service tickets. These are usually user accounts because traditionally, most organizations, when they scope a service account, it's a user account that's used for services. And so they have an SPN attached to it, or a service principal name. And so those accounts are able to, anytime a client requests to use that service account is going to request a service ticket from Active Directory. These tickets can be requested by anyone on the network because it's a client that's requesting access to the server. The service account will be the one to trigger the service ticket. So what attackers can do is they can grab these tickets, try to crack them offline, and reveal the password of the service account. Why does this matter? Well, if your service account has high privileges, like domain admin, because no one would ever have a service account out there with domain admin privileges, right? Of course, there are so many vendors that say, hey, just put a service account in here. We need domain admin rights. It's the easiest thing, instead of like going through and doing the proper RBAC permissions for what their actual, thing needs. Just give a domain admin. So giving domain admin or really highly privileged permissions to a service account is pretty standard, has been pretty standard in the industry. So if you have that and you're able to crack the passwords of these service tickets, then obviously you've given the attackers a really easy way to move laterally in your organization. Now, how can you work on this? Well, you can obviously force stronger encryption via GPO. Like you can make sure that AES 128 or better 256 are forced and used. The problem is that all the systems involved, the domain controller, the services, the clients, all must support that level of encryption. If you don't, it will default to the lower ones. And there are certainly a lot of legacy apps that rely on the lower level encryption types. And if you upgrade to the higher level encryption, it doesn't necessarily stop Kerberoasting entirely. It does make it extremely difficult or nearly impossible, because if you're using a higher level of encryption, brute forcing it is impossible in today's computing, right? So like, let's say you require a 15 character password, and then they get the ticket and they try to brute force that 15 character password with AES 256 encryption. A supercomputer today can guess maybe like 1 billion guesses per second. That would take 15 trillion years to brute force that password. So, more time than we have. So nearly impossible. And then the other important thing to remember is that Kerberos doesn't store passwords. It derives keys from the passwords that are stored, and then it using that selected encryption algorithm. So RC4 or AES 128 or AES 256. If that account was created when RC4 was the default or enabled, its Kerberos key is based on RC4. So even if you configure the system later to force AES 256 or prefer that account will still use RC4 until you reset its password. So even if you were to create a GPO to say only AES 128 and 256 can be used, you still want to reset the passwords of these service accounts so that it will regenerate that key, that Kerberos key. And of course, again, the issue with service accounts is that they're often long-lived and they rarely have their passwords reset. And if you do reset them, that can cause some disruption in services, right? Hopefully you don't have it hard coded anywhere, and but anyways, it makes them like prime targets for Kerberoasting in general, right? So I'll pause there and see, Adam, if you have any thoughts before we get into like some actual to-dos here.
I think when you walk through all of this, Andy, it does help you contextualize Senator Wyden's comments where, well, let's get a little further and then we can unpack that a little more, right? So obviously today I can give you a little Microsoft perspective. We launched, and we have talked about on the show many times now, this company-wide engineering effort known as the Secure Future Initiative. It started, Andy, was it back in 2023? I think it was initially kicked off and really gained steam in 2024 and beyond, and continues to be a major focus today, where you have CEO permission to prioritize security above all else. And traditionally, Microsoft has very much focused on maintaining compatibility over a very long time because enterprise customers demand it, as opposed to breaking things in the name of security. And I think you will start to see this shift, and I've mentioned that on this show, to where in the past, a decision may have been made of, we know RC4 has these issues with it. We know that it was broken back in the 90s. However, we need to not break these legacy apps, these legacy line of business applications. So we're going to continue to allow it, even though we will prefer AES by default and have for many, many years, unless customers explicitly disable supporting RC4 altogether, which remains a customer choice. Windows does not ship out of the box with it disabled. Now, I'm going to give a little bit of a tease for what's to come. That's going to change. And Andy, I know we're going to talk about that in a moment. But if you understand and view through the contextual lens, in the past, Microsoft would make that decision. Today's Microsoft is not going to make that decision. They're going to make different ones where it's going to be secure by default, secure by design. And if customers want to back out security, we may allow that, but in some cases in the future, we're not even going to allow you to turn it into an insecure setting. It's going to be very different moving forward. So just to kind of give that heads up, that Secure Future Initiative is going to empower and enable product groups like the Windows teams to make different choices in the future. Now, Andy, I think you walked through this pretty well on why was it used, where is it used, and give you some of that understanding on how to change it. Now, we've talked about stuff like this recently. Remember that one where I kind of got really wound up around the Windows Hello for Business, whatever it was, however it was classified as a defect in it or whatever. Mm-hmm. And I said, this actually has nothing to do with Windows Hello for Business. This is Entra ID, where customers have allowed weaker multi-factor authentication methods to be used. You can, in fact, use them, and all the vulnerabilities with them, like SMS, has the ability to do SIM swaps, and phishing is really easy through those methods. Similar scenario here. If you still allow RC4 in your environment, then all of the challenges that RC4 comes with, you are at risk of as well. But This is just like in the Entra ID side, how that team, that product group has really pushed stronger phish resistant methods and has really de-emphasized the ability to use those weaker methods moving forward. Same here. So more to come on this, and we'll get to that in just a moment on the show. But I think that's all interesting to kind of break down and understand as we have this conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. So like, our show is always educating, but I usually like to give some to-dos, right? Like go find this in your environment.
100%.
So let's talk about that. So first off, you should audit your accounts for RC4 usage. You can do this through PowerShell, just do a search for it. You can also do it through third-party tools. So find out if you're using RC4 at all. And if you are, you should find out why you're using it. And if you need it, you should scope RC4 usage to very specific, like OUs in your Active Directory with very specific systems or users that need that application or whatever it is that you're doing, right? So narrow the blast radius of that usage. Better yet, if there's nothing, then just disable it completely through GPO or registry settings. And after you do that, you should reset your Surface accounts to regenerate keys using AES if there are any old ones that haven't had their passwords changed in a while. And that's a big process, right? Like I'm saying this like off the cuff, but that's a monumental effort if you have to like rotate passwords for Surface accounts. So I'm not like minimizing the effort here, but obviously like this is something that you should be doing as part of Active Directory security and health. So that's part of a security engineer's job is to do this. So those are some to-dos. Some other things that you can look at are, if you're using a security tool like Defender for Identity or Defender XDR, check to see, like I know that for Microsoft's security tools, there are alerts to detect Kerberoasting related activities. So you might want to look at your whatever security tool you're using, if it's not Microsoft, to check to see if it can detect those type of activities. If there's like a specific client that's requesting a ton of service tickets, that may be a indicator for that type of activity. You should try to use group managed service accounts or delegated managed service accounts whenever possible. Switch from user accounts to these GMSAs or DMSAs, and then audit any accounts with SPNs. SPNs, those service principal names. If you have them, they are susceptible to Kerberoasting because those are the accounts that are requesting the service tickets. And so you should get rid of them. If you have to use them, limit the use as much as possible. And then also, again, rotate that password so it's not a weak password. So, and then finally, I gave that number for 15 character password. There's 15 trillion years to brute force. Now, with RC4, again, there are vulnerabilities within the cipher itself. So RC4, actually, if you have a lengthy password, it's pretty hard to brute force. It's actually pretty resistant to brute forcing. It's just the vulnerabilities in the cipher make it weak. And so there are ways to get around brute forcing and kind of like getting an educated guess, so to speak. So kind of jumpstarting the cracking of that algorithm. But you do want to have longer passwords in general. One of the things that the senator wrote in his letter, he was really upset about, was that Microsoft recommends longer passwords for privileged accounts, but we don't mandate them. And like Adam said, this is something that we've left up to customers for a long time. Like we've never said this account needs to have this long of a password, right? Like that's something that there is a default, like I think password length, maybe like 8 characters or something like that when Active Directory first boots up, but 8 characters obviously is not good enough today. However, like we've never mandated in Active Directory a customer, for your domain admin, you must have 15 characters. That's something we leave up to the customers to scope a GPO to say what they want their default length to be. Although an interesting question with our SFI, maybe we might or we should dictate password length for organizations. But if we do that, I can imagine there's going to be some pushback from organizations who say, hey, you can't tell us, that our admin passwords must be 15 characters or longer, right? Like, so
it's my own hardware. It's my own environment.
Exactly. Yeah. Like you're running your own server. So that's part of the issue. He's mad that Microsoft doesn't dictate this. So, I get that, but we've never have. It's people's own environment. We give recommendations. We give guidance on how to secure this stuff.
Security baselines.
Yeah. And it's up to you to implement them. So Case in point here, Microsoft has been phasing out RC4 support, but I found an interesting security advisory that was published back in November 2013. And this was when we basically created the GPO to get rid of RC4. So the security
So that's 12 years ago.
Yeah, a long time ago, right? Even before Kerberoasting was publicly known as an attack. And so this was the first part of that security advisory. Microsoft is announcing the availability of an update for supported editions of Windows 7, Windows Server 2008 R2, Windows 8, Windows Server 2012, and Windows RT to address known weaknesses in RC4. The update supports the removal of RC4 as an available cipher on affected systems through the registry settings. It also allows developers to remove RC4 in individual applications through the use of the SCH use strong crypto flag in the S-channel cred structure. These options are not enabled by default. Recommendation: Microsoft recommends that customers download and install the update immediately, then test the new settings in their environment. So way back in 2013, we had the security advisory. Kerberoasting's been known for over 10 years. And I know, even talking with like Sean Metcalf, who is an AD security guru, I've heard him speak many times. He still goes into customer environments and he'll find user accounts with SPNs. He'll find accounts they're susceptible to Kerberoasting. So this is something that still is there. If you're running an AD environment, especially one that has been established for multiple years, there's probably accounts there that are susceptible to this. So, this is something that you have to work at. Microsoft Edge and Internet Explorer 11 dropped RC support back in 2016. And then Microsoft did release, and this is what Adam was alluding to earlier, is that we did release a statement saying that in future updates of Windows 11 H2 and Server 2025, Microsoft intends to disable RC4 encryption by default, and that Microsoft recommends manually disabling the RC4 encryption type on Surface accounts in environments without these updates. So again, I think the default behavior is once like Windows 11 and Windows Server drop that support and disable it by default, if you have services that are going to request using RC4, they're just going to fail because the clients won't support them because it's just turned off. So it's coming, and then you're going to have to like force RC4 to be turned on if you still have services that use them. But I began this as like, we're in 2025 and these are attacks that have been known for over a decade and it's still happening. I get the anger of the senator here. Microsoft, I would say, is taking steps to, the Secure Future Initiative has only been around for a couple years, less than 2 years, I think, total time since the announcement. And, we're making steps to make things more secure, but that does come at an operational cost to organizations that have not, started moving in that direction. If we disable RC4 by default, there will be organizations that will be affected, I believe. So, but it's coming, and make sure that you're auditing your accounts and scoping GPOs and doing the thing to. There are known mitigations for Kerberoasting, and you should be doing those things right now if you haven't already done them.
If you go read the book Hardcore Software by Steven Sinofsky, who ran the Office organization during which time the ribbon was first shipped. And if you remember when the ribbon was first shipped in Office, the conversation around it was pretty intense, especially from IT departments. We're going to have to retrain all our people. This is terrible. This is the worst thing ever. Well, the ribbon's still around. That was 2007, I think it first shipped. And here we are 18 years later, and the ribbon interface is pretty standard across all of the Microsoft productivity apps today. And I think widely liked, but it took a long time to get adopted. He talks through the balancing act of shipping new features or trying to innovate in Office while balancing that with the needs of IT departments and the sales team and the feedback he got from sales teams at Microsoft too. And I'm not saying anybody should feel bad for Microsoft. It's almost a $4 trillion company, has been very successful over a long time. But what that book illustrates is the push-pull here and the different forces at work. Because ultimately, Andy, if you want to look at this very tactically, you beautifully laid it out. This is not new. Microsoft has released guidance for many years. There are known ways to mitigate this. You have to do the work yourself because none of this has been configured in its most secure fashion by default, out of respecting our customers' existing environments and their legacy needs and not wanting to break stuff. That's ultimately the push-pull here. The decision was, we're not going to break things for our customers. We will educate them. We will make every effort through security baselines, through security notifications, through recommended configurations that you should get to this state. Our security tools like Defender for Identity will flag these configurations as insecure. They will look for potential risky behavior. It's all been there, but to the senator's point, it hasn't been secure by default. It hasn't. And that's a difficult balancing act. And traditionally, Microsoft has erred on the side of, let's maintain compatibility. Let's not break stuff on our customers' behalf. This is our customer's environment. They have the right to configure it how they want, even if it's not how we would configure it. We're going to go out of our way to educate and teach how to do it the right way. But ultimately, that's a customer's decision, and they need to do that work. So there's probably more than one example of this in other enterprise software vendors and other choices that have been made. I understand all sides here. And I think for the most part, everyone is trying to act in the best interest for the greater good. And the world has changed, right? Where it may have made sense many years ago to err on the side of maintaining legacy compatibility and putting the onus on customers to harden their environment when they were ready. And the world today, where the risk is so much higher and more pervasive, it may now make sense to break stuff by default and educate customers that, yeah, your stuff's going to break if you install this. So be aware of that. And if you need to turn it back off, you can. Here's how. But we don't recommend it. It's a bad idea, but we are going to do that moving forward. So I'm sure there is some armchair quarterback out there who says, well, this is too little too late. This should have been disabled years ago. Fair feedback. I can take that feedback. I think Andy can too. And we can all have a conversation around it. The fact is, it is happening now with the future update to Windows 11 and Windows Server. And I think you will see more of that moving forward. And part of this too, why we keep talking about Secure Future Initiative, is we need to educate our customers that our approach is changing. And they need to be prepared for that, because there's going to be something that's going to happen. And I don't even know what it is. It's hard to predict where the objection comes from. But at some point, Microsoft is going to ship something that's secure by default, and it's going to really piss off a lot of people. They're going to be really upset about it. They are. And it's going to be, I thought you guys didn't do that. I thought you maintained legacy compatibility above all else. Compatibility above all else is no longer the mantra at Microsoft. Security above all else is the mantra at Microsoft. In fact, Satya Nadella, when he announced the Secure Future Initiative to employees, he said, if you're ever given a trade-off between something else and security, do security. So when I say we have CEO permission to choose security, we have email to prove it. We've got receipts, as the kids would say. And so that changes the game. So, hey, please go out and audit all of your accounts for RC usage. Please disable RC4 in your group policies. If you need to keep it enabled, do what Andy said and scope it down to a very limited subset of your use or some other grouping. And then please go reset passwords for any accounts that were still using RC4 ciphers. So those are regenerated with AES. Those are your go-dos, and everyone needs to go do them if you haven't done it since 2013 when that guidance first came out. It's never too late to start. But with that, I think there's a broader conversation here on the defaults and the tyranny of the defaults and how you make those decisions moving forward. And I think that's going to change and evolve. And that's part of us learning and growing as cybersecurity practitioners, and cybersecurity being part of every process, everywhere, at every company, whether you're a tech company or not. Cybersecurity decision-making gets baked into every decision we make. And that's the broader change happening here. And I'm excited to continue to pull that thread and see where it goes.
And there are actually, when you talk about SFI and how we've approached a lot of things, there's multiple examples of where we have enabled things without really with that in mind of like that default. So one thing that comes to mind is, the MFA mandatory for admin portals for 5, right? Like
and Azure.
and Azure, right? Like all the admin portals in Azure, if you are an admin, MFA is required because we have telemetry that shows that there are still admins without MFA. And so
A lot of them.
many of them, it's actually shocking how
It's
many
shocking.
admins do not have MFA. So Microsoft is turning it on by default, and there have been multiple notifications, public blogs and statements, and it's getting turned on, I think, really soon. There was an extension that was happening, and that has, I think, expired as well. So it's coming. Another one, I remember listening to the engineer and the product program manager who was in charge of disabling legacy authentications for every tenant. So we were disabling legacy authentication for Exchange, and we had telemetry about that and how many organizations, and like they sent out messages in the message center, like they had telemetry on how many customers actually opened up the messages and read them, which is interesting in itself. Message center, like as an aside, is like the main way that Microsoft pushes out messages for your admins. But in the end, it was listening to him to talk about it, it was kind of like, well, we're just going to disable it for millions of tenants and then see who screams about it because we need to do this. And so, they did come back. There was like maybe 5% of customers like escalated, and they did turn it back on for them for specific reasons, but then they continued, and it was like this huge project to completely disable legacy authentication for Exchange and for Microsoft. So there's multiple examples of that where security.
And that started way before SFI. That process of turning off legacy auth, that's been going on forever. And it's so, we want to be cognizant of not disrupting business for our customers, but at the same time, moving them to a more secure state. Like that one predates SFI. A lot of the stuff the Entra team has been doing predates SFI, the Secure Future Initiative as well. That has just empowered teams to go faster or do more with that too. But it's, again, I'm not asking one to feel bad for Microsoft. I'm not saying that, but at the same time that there are examples like this where you can say, why haven't you done more? There are so many different product groups and so many different teams of people who have been working really hard for a really long time to try to get services to a more secure state, to try to up the game of security. And that balancing act, that push-pull, that tug game with customers has been really challenging. And not that customers are doing anything wrong. They have challenges too. You're being asked to do more with less. You don't have enough heads in your department. You're being asked to support legacy services when you flag them for leadership for years that this is insecure and needs to be replaced. You're stuck between a rock and a hard place. Management said, make it work. Microsoft saying, we're going to make it not work. Now what do you do? I get it. Technology is more complicated than people in leadership positions like to think it is. There's always, I have been critical in the past of when we've had these discussions about building encryption that the good guys can break into, but not the bad guys, right? The proverbial encryption backdoor, but only for the good guys. And whenever it's been told like, that's not possible, you can't do that, sometimes leaders have this reaction of nerd harder. Just go work harder at it and you can figure it out. If you guys would just nerd harder about it, it can be done. And it's just, that's not the case. It can't be done. And so it's just worth pointing out too, that there's just a lot more complexity to this than people let on. And our listeners and viewers know that. That's why we love our audience, because you appreciate how difficult this is. And there are multiple mouths to feed always. And so none of this is cut and dry as it appears. So that's where, as we always encourage, focus on what you can control. And Andy gave you 3 really good go-dos that you can control.
All right. Well, our second episode on Kerberoasting in the last 5 years. So let's make sure this one sticks, and hopefully we can move everyone to a more secure state. Thanks for watching and listening as always. And the links to the topics that we talked about, the articles that we used for the show, will be in the show notes as references if you want to read them. Our contact information will be in the show notes if you have any questions or topics you want us to talk about in the future. Thanks. We'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJBrewer. See you at our next episode.